My name is Leon Whitaker. I am 69 years old, and my life changed the day I finally stopped paying for my own disrespect. Last Tuesday, I quietly walked into my bank, changed my details, and moved my monthly pension to a secure, private card that no one else on earth could touch. 2 hours later, the front door of my little guest house was violently kicked open. My daughter Rachel and her husband Blake stood in the entryway, shaking with rage. Blake screamed that the old debit card had just been swallowed by an ATM at a luxury car dealership downtown, and he demanded my new personal identification number that instant. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, looked him dead in the eye, and gave him an answer that drained every drop of blood from his face. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little world, tell me in the comments which city you are watching from, and hit like and subscribe if you believe respect should be earned and never demanded. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. The wood of the doorframe splintered inward, scattering shards of white paint across my clean floor. I did not flinch. I sat at my small kitchen table, my hands perfectly steady around a ceramic mug. Blake stormed in first, his face a violent shade of purple, veins bulging against the collar of a designer shirt I had unknowingly paid for. Rachel came in behind him, hyperventilating, clutching a leather handbag that my pension had also unknowingly bought. Blake did not bother with a greeting. He slammed his fist onto my table so hard the coffee sloshed over the rim and burned my knuckles. And he leaned in close, his breath sour with espresso and blind fury. He screamed that he had just been humiliated in the finance office of a high-end European dealership. He had been putting a $10,000 cash deposit on a new sports SUV, and when he went to the lobby ATM to pull a cash advance on my card, the machine confiscated it and flashed a message that the account was permanently closed for suspected fraud. The salesman, he said, had looked at him like a common criminal. He thrust his open palm flat in front of my face and demanded the new card and the new PIN right that second so he could drive back downtown and secure his vehicle before someone else bought it. Behind him, Rachel nodded frantically, whining that the dealership would not hold the car much longer. I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what I did, because it matters to everything that follows. I was not born to money. I came up with a trowel in my hand, laying brick and stone through Colorado winters cold enough to freeze mortar in the bucket. And over 40 years, I built that trade into a masonry company that poured and faced the foundations of half the commercial buildings in the Denver suburbs. My wife, Ada, kept the books at our kitchen table for 30 of those years, and she was the sharpest person I ever knew. She used to tell me I could read a wall better than any man alive, could find the one weak joint in 100 feet of stone, but that I was blind as poured concrete when it came to the people I loved. She was right. She was right about that in a way I would not fully understand until 3 years after I buried her. I did not raise my voice. I did not tremble. I reached for a paper napkin, wiped the spilled coffee from my knuckles, and looked up at the two of them. I let the silence stretch until Rachel began to shift uncomfortably on her feet. And into that silence, I let 3 years of memory rise up quietly in my mind. Because to understand this kitchen, you have to understand the graveside, where it truly began. 3 years ago, standing over my late wife Ada's fresh grave, Rachel wept and begged me to leave my own home and come live in the guest house on her property, where she could take care of me. She told me she wanted to handle my weekly grocery shopping, so I would not have to drive to the market in my grief. She asked for my debit card, the one tied to my $5,800 monthly pension, and I gave it to her without a second thought, because she was my only child, and I trusted her the way you trust your own hands. That was the crack. It was hairline, invisible, the kind of thing you would never notice unless you spent your whole life, as I did, learning where structures quietly begin to fail. At the time, I saw only a grieving daughter trying to care for her grieving father, and I was grateful. God help me. I was grateful. The guest house was small but clean, at the back of a property I knew well, and for the first few months it truly seemed like kindness. Rachel would wave from the main house. Blake would nod at me across the driveway. And every month, like clockwork, my pension landed in the account they now controlled. But kindness that is really a harvest reveals itself slowly. The way water finds its way into stone and freezes and splits it open one winter at a time. First, the visits thinned. Then the groceries got cheaper and smaller. Then the phone calls to the main house started going unanswered. Even the night I woke burning with a fever that turned out to be pneumonia and lay in that guest house for 6 days with no one to bring me so much as a glass of water. I told myself they were busy. I told myself a lot of things. A man will tell himself almost anything rather than admit his own child is bleeding him. So instead of answering Blake's demand, I asked Rachel a very simple question. I asked her what she had bought me for dinner that week. She blinked, thrown completely off guard, and looked to Blake for help before mumbling that she had dropped off groceries on Monday. I stood up, walked the 4 steps to my little pantry, and swung the door wide open. Inside sat 3 dented cans of generic chicken soup and a half-empty box of stale crackers. I turned back to them and stated a fact, calmly, the way I used to read a load calculation. My pension had deposited over $60,000 into that account in the last 12 months alone. I pointed to the dented cans. I asked them whether that was what $60,000 bought a man in today's economy. What they did not know, what they could never have imagined, was that I had already spent 2 quiet months building the very binder that was about to end them. It had started the morning I finally admitted the truth to myself, standing in that pantry looking at 3 cans of soup, doing the arithmetic in my head the way I used to estimate a materials order. $5,800 a month, in, for 36 months. Soup, out. The numbers did not balance, and numbers that do not balance are a lie wearing a suit. So I had gone to the bank, in person, and requested 3 years of statements on my own account, which was still, whatever they believed, legally mine. I had sat at that little table night after night with a highlighter and a magnifying glass, and I had reconstructed every charge, cross-referenced against dates, matched to receipts I quietly pulled, until I held in my hands a complete forensic record of my own slow robbery. I am a builder. I do not act on feelings. I act on load calculations. And by that Tuesday, the math was finished. Blake rolled his eyes and let out a loud, theatrical sigh. He told me I was being dramatic, that I did not need much money anyway, since I just sat around the guest house all day doing nothing. He said they were doing me a massive favor by letting me live on their property at all. Then he slapped the table again and demanded we stop wasting time talking about soup while his luxury reservation expired. And that was the moment I decided the time for patience was finally over. I walked to the small bookshelf in the corner, reached behind a row of my old masonry manuals, and pulled out a heavy black binder. I carried it back and dropped it on the table in front of him, and the thud filled the small room like a stone landing in still water. I opened the cover. Inside were hundreds of pages of highlighted bank statements, itemized notes, and printed receipts. I looked Blake dead in the eye and told him the account had not glitched. I told him I had walked into the branch at 8 o'clock that morning, closed it permanently, and routed every future pension payment to a private institution that neither of them would ever see. He scoffed and called me a paranoid old fool, insisting he had only ever used the money for property upkeep. So I turned to the first tab, and I began to read his expenditures aloud, my voice as level as a judge reading a sentence. I read the date and the amount of a $4,000 charge for a private cabana in Miami, booked during the exact week I lay in this guest house recovering from pneumonia, alone, running a fever, while Rachel did not answer a single one of my calls. I read a string of $2,000 dinners at a downtown steakhouse. I read designer boutiques, spa weekends, first-class flights, a country club initiation fee. Page after page, I read the shape of a life that my 40 years of labor had quietly funded while I ate soup out of a dented can. Rachel's face went pale. Blake's went red. And for the first time, a flicker of real fear crossed his eyes. Because a man who has been caught spending can talk his way out of it, but a man who has been documented cannot. I turned then to my daughter, and I read her a different page, a quieter one. I read her the date of a $2,000 spa retreat, booked the same weekend she had told me over the phone that she was too swamped with work to drive me to my own wife's memorial mass. I read her the receipt for a designer coat, purchased the week she told me the budget was too tight to replace the space heater that had died in my guest house that January. I did not raise my voice for any of it. I just laid the facts on the table between us, one after another, the way you set stones in a wall, until the whole ugly structure of what she had allowed stood finished in front of her. She would not look at me. She looked at Blake, waiting for him to fix it, the way she always waited for him to fix everything. And in that one glance, I saw exactly how thoroughly she had handed her spine to another man. Then Blake did something that told me exactly how far this had already gone. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folder of his own, and tossed it onto my binder with a smug little smile. He told me to open it. Inside was a typed letter on the letterhead of a medical office I had never visited, signed by a doctor I had never met, stating that I was becoming increasingly paranoid, forgetful, and unable to manage my own affairs. Clipped to it was a general power of attorney, already drawn up, with a line at the bottom waiting for my signature. Blake explained it to me slowly, the way you would explain something to a child. He said I was going to sign that power of attorney and hand him control of my finances, quietly, tonight. And in exchange, I could keep living in the guest house. But if I refused, he said, he would file a guardianship petition at the county courthouse the very next morning. He would use that doctor's affidavit to have a judge declare me mentally incompetent. He would strip me of every legal right I had, seize control of my estate, and place me in the cheapest, most miserable state nursing facility he could find, where no one would ever listen to a word I said again. He smiled while he said it. He actually smiled. And in that smile, I finally saw the whole man clearly, the way you see a wall clearly only after the plaster comes off. This was not a son-in-law who had gotten carried away with my money. This was a man who had sat down, calmly, at some point in the last several months, and decided that the most efficient way to solve his debts was to have his wife's father declared insane and buried in a state facility, while he stripped the estate to the studs. He had shopped for a doctor the way you shop for lumber. He had drawn up the paperwork in advance. He had rehearsed this exact ultimatum, and he delivered it in my own kitchen, over my own coffee, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no by someone he could not intimidate. He had no idea that he was standing in front of the one man who had spent 50 years learning precisely how much pressure a structure can take before it turns on the fool leaning against it. I did not smile back. I stood up, walked to my door, and told them both to get out of my home immediately, before I called the police to report the forged medical document sitting on my table. Blake laughed, told me no one would believe a senile old man over a licensed physician, and warned me that the courthouse opened at 9. Then he grabbed Rachel by the arm and walked out through the broken door he had kicked in, so certain of his victory that he did not even bother to threaten me again. I stood in the wreckage of my own front entry, and I felt the strangest thing settle over me. Not fear. Clarity. The precise, cold clarity I used to feel standing beneath a bridge, running my hand over a column, when I finally located the fracture that everyone else had missed. Because Blake had made one enormous mistake. He thought he was pressuring a lonely, frightened old man. He had forgotten that before I was a widower eating soup in a guest house, I spent 50 years as a masonry contractor. I built the foundations that hold up half the commercial buildings in this city. I know exactly how a structure fails, and I know exactly how to bring one down when it deserves to fall. That night, I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with my binder and a legal pad, and I planned the demolition the way I had once planned every pore and every joint of my career. Slowly, deliberately, from the foundation up. There is a difference in my trade between destruction and demolition, and it is a difference most people never learn. Destruction is what an angry man does with a sledgehammer. It is loud and messy, and it usually hurts the man swinging as much as the wall. Demolition is a discipline. You study the structure. You find the members that carry the load. You understand exactly how the weight wants to fall, and then you make a few small, precise cuts in the right places, and you step back and you let gravity finish the job for you. Blake wanted a brawl. He wanted me to shout, to sign in a panic, to make threats a court could later call the ravings of a confused old man. I was not going to give him a brawl. I was going to give him gravity. I filled 4 pages of that legal pad before dawn, and not one line of it was written in anger. It was all written in physics. The next morning, before that courthouse ever opened, I was sitting in the office of Aaron Feld. Aaron was not a friendly neighborhood lawyer. He was a ruthless, expensive estate attorney who had helped me structure my original holdings decades ago. And he was the one man in this city I trusted completely. I set the binder on his desk, and then I set Blake's forged affidavit and the power of attorney beside it. Aaron read the affidavit twice, and his jaw tightened. He told me that a forged medical document used to attempt a guardianship was not a family dispute. It was a serious felony, and it meant they had been planning this for months. He picked up his phone, called his senior paralegal, and ordered her to drop everything and run an emergency check on every legal filing under Blake's name in every county in the state. He wanted to know exactly which corrupt doctor Blake had paid. While we waited, Aaron pulled my master estate file up onto his monitors, and he reviewed the deed to the house where Rachel and Blake lived. Because here is what neither of them had ever fully understood. I had paid for that house in cash 15 years ago. I walked into a real estate office and wrote a certified check for the entire purchase price, because Rachel was young and terrified of a 30-year mortgage, and I wanted my only child to have a fortress that no recession and no lost job could ever take from her. I handed her the keys to a home with a completely clean title. No mortgage, no bank. The dirt, the concrete, the walls, and the roof belonged entirely to me. Blake had always hated living in a house he did not legally own, and I was about to find out just how much he hated it. I remember the day I bought it. Rachel was newly married and pregnant with a baby she would later lose, and she was lying awake at night terrified of a 30-year mortgage, terrified of ending up like the young couples she watched get foreclosed on after the crash. And I thought about my own father, who rented his whole life and died owning nothing. and I decided that no child of mine would ever lie awake afraid of a bank. So I emptied a large piece of my life's savings into a single cashier's check, and I bought her a fortress outright. I kept the deed in my own name for one reason and one reason only. Ada and I agreed that if Rachel's marriage ever failed, the house had to be untouchable, safe from any man who might one day try to take half of it in a divorce. We built that protection for her out of love. We never imagined the man she married would try to tunnel underneath it. Aaron ran a real-time title audit on the property, his fingers flying, the office silent except for the clicking of keys. Then he stopped. The cursor blinked. He leaned toward the screen, and slowly he turned the monitor around to face me, and he pointed to a lien that had been recorded against the property just 3 weeks ago. Blake had not only been draining my pension, he had found a way to bypass the title and borrow against the physical dirt beneath my daughter's feet. Aaron opened the filing, and the document rendered on the screen. It was a home equity line of credit, using the house as direct collateral. I looked at the approved principal amount, $320,000. My breath caught for just a second. $320,000, borrowed against the very walls I had bought to keep my daughter safe. Aaron explained, in his calm and merciless way, that a home equity line works like a giant credit card tied to the value of the property, and that when the borrower stops paying, the bank forecloses and takes the house. Blake had strapped a financial bomb to my daughter's living room and lit the fuse. I asked Aaron the obvious question. I told him I was the sole legal owner on that deed, and I asked how any regulated bank could approve a loan of that size without my physical presence and my consent. Aaron did not answer. He simply scrolled to the last page, the signature page, where 3 lines waited at the bottom. Primary applicant, co-applicant, and guarantor and legal property owner. That third line was meant for me, and on it, in dark digital ink, was my full legal name, Leonard James Whitaker. But it was not my hand that wrote it. I spent 50 years drafting stone layouts and signing contracts with a hand so precise, my crews used to joke I could sign my name with a level. I know my own signature the way I know my own heartbeat, and the thing on that screen was a careful, traced forgery. Blake had not simply mismanaged my money. He had forged the signature of the legal property owner onto a federally regulated loan document to steal $320,000 against a house he had no right to touch. That is not a gray area. That is bank fraud and forgery, and it carries years in a federal prison. In one morning, the entire balance of power had silently inverted, and neither Rachel nor Blake had the faintest idea. I sat back in the leather chair and let the full structure of their scheme assemble itself in my mind, joint by joint. The pension, siphoned for 3 years to fund a lifestyle while I ate from cans. The forged medical affidavit to declare me insane. The guardianship petition to strip me of my voice before I could ever object. And the forged home equity loan to drain the last $320,000 out of the walls themselves before they locked me away where I could never sign a complaint. It was, I had to admit, an ambitious demolition. But they had made the one mistake that every arrogant builder eventually makes. They had never once inspected the foundation. They never learned that the frightened old man in the guest house was the one who had poured it. Aaron's paralegal called back within the hour. The doctor who signed the affidavit had lost 2 prior malpractice suits and had a documented history of selling exactly these kinds of paid opinions. Aaron leaned across his desk and told me, quietly, that I was no longer the target of this case. I was the owner of it. He explained the strategy the way a good foreman explains a sequence, and I understood it instantly, because it was exactly how I would have staged a controlled collapse. The temptation, he said, would be to run to the courthouse first thing and try to block the guardianship petition before Blake could file it. But that was the amateur move. If we blocked it, Blake would simply retreat, cover his tracks, quietly unwind the forged loan, and slither away to try again in some cleaner form a year later. No, we wanted him to file. We wanted him to walk into a courtroom and formally submit a forged medical affidavit to a sitting judge, under his own name on the official record, because the moment he did that, his crime would stop being something we had to prove and become something he had personally handed to the court in writing. A patient man does not stop his enemy from digging. He hands him a bigger shovel and points him toward the softest ground. Blake filed the petition the next morning, so confident he did not even hire real counsel. He walked into that hearing expecting to present a confused, soup-fed old man to a sympathetic judge. Instead, he found me sitting beside Aaron Feld in a pressed suit, sharp and calm and entirely in command of my own mind. I watched Blake's face when he walked in and saw me there, and I watched the exact moment his confidence developed its first hairline crack. He had rehearsed a story about a frail, forgetful old man, and instead, he was looking at a straight-backed contractor in a good suit who met his eyes without blinking. His lawyer, some tired man he had clearly hired cheap, began to read the petition into the record, and I sat perfectly still and let him build his little wall, brick by brick, knowing that every brick he laid was one more piece of evidence against his own client. When they presented the medical affidavit as their centerpiece, I saw Rachel, seated behind Blake, twist her hands in her lap. She would not look at me. She had come to the courthouse to watch her own father be declared insane, and some part of her, I think, was only now beginning to understand what she had let into our family. When Blake's borrowed lawyer presented the medical affidavit, Aaron rose and presented the doctor's disciplinary record, the man's history of paid opinions, and a sworn statement that I had never once been his patient. When they argued that I could not manage my own affairs, Aaron laid out my estate documents, my binder of their theft, and my own lucid testimony. And then, for the finish, Aaron slid across the bench the county record of a $320,000 home equity loan forged in my name against a property I solely owned. The judge's face changed in an instant. The guardianship petition did not just fail, it detonated. The judge dismissed it from the bench and, seeing the forged loan and the forged medical document, referred the entire matter to the district attorney and to the bank's fraud division on the spot. Blake was arrested within the week for forgery, bank fraud, and attempting to defraud the court. The bank, discovering that its $320,000 loan had been secured with a forged owner's signature, voided the debt and came after Blake personally for every cent it had already disbursed, money he had already spent on cars and cabanas and cheap dreams. The very bomb he had strapped to my daughter's house blew up in his own hands, exactly as I had known it would, the moment I saw that traced signature. I did not attend a single one of his hearings. I did not need to. I had spent my whole career watching structures I designed hold under load, while lesser work failed around them, and I felt no urge to stand and watch this one collapse. The reports reached me secondhand, the way distant thunder reaches a man on a porch. The doctor surrendered his license and took a plea. Blake's cheap lawyer withdrew. And Blake himself, stripped of the money and the house and the fantasy of the life he thought marrying my daughter had entitled him to, discovered what every parasite eventually discovers, that the host he had been feeding on was the only thing that had ever kept him warm, and that he had killed it with his own greed. As for Rachel, she came to me one last time at a small diner far from the courthouse, and she cried, and she told me she had known nothing about the forgeries, only about the spending. Maybe that was even true. But she had watched her father eat soup out of a can for 3 years and said nothing. She had let a man forge my name and plot to lock me in a facility, and her only concern had ever been the temperature of her luxury car. I did not yell at her. I did not gloat. I simply told her that I had spent my whole life pouring a foundation strong enough to hold her, and that she had chosen to build her house with a man who took a sledgehammer to it. Then I paid for her coffee, and I stood up, and I walked out, and I did not look back. She had traded a father who loved her and a fully owned estate for a criminal who left her with a motel room and nothing else. With Blake facing his charges and the toxic limb finally severed, I did the last thing they ever expected. I sold the property, all of it. I owned it free and clear, so I signed it over to a commercial developer for a sum that made my whole ordeal look like pocket change. And I walked through the little ruined guest house one final time, past the door Blake had kicked in, and I packed a single leather bag. I stood for a moment in that empty guest house before I left, in the small kitchen where I had eaten 3 years of soup and read 3 years of lies. And I did not feel bitterness. I felt something closer to what I used to feel when a crew finished clearing a condemned building I had once been called to inspect. The ground was clean again. Whatever they built here next would not be my concern, and it would not carry my name. And that was exactly as it should be. I ran my hand one last time along the doorframe Blake had splintered, feeling the raw wood under my fingers, and then I let it go. A man cannot pour a new foundation while he is still standing in the rubble of the old one. I did not take the old manuals or the cheap mugs. I packed my best clothes, my passport, and the leather key fob to my late wife Ada's pristine 1968 muscle car, which was already resting safely in a climate-controlled storage vault downtown, far beyond anyone's reach. Then I zipped the bag, and I walked out of that guest house for the very last time. And I did not look back at the empty ground behind me. I told the driver to take me straight to the international airport, and I bought a first-class one-way ticket. For 40 years I had saved and invested and sacrificed my own comfort for the sake of my family, and the time for sacrifice was finally over. I settled into a wide leather seat as the engines roared and the city shrank below the window, and I flew across the ocean toward an entirely blank canvas, leaving behind the betrayal, the greed, and the exhausting war. I slept for most of that flight, deeply and without dreams, the way I had not slept in 3 years. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a flight attendant brought me a warm cup of coffee, and I drank it slowly while the dark water passed far below. And I thought about the strange arithmetic of my life. I had spent 40 years believing that the whole point of building something was to give it away, to leave a fortress for a child and a legacy for a bloodline. And I had learned, at 69, that a legacy handed to someone who does not respect it is not a gift at all. It is a temptation. It is a heavy beam laid carelessly across a fault line, waiting. Ada had understood that better than I ever did. I raised my little paper cup in a quiet toast to her, somewhere out over the middle of the ocean, and I let the last of my anger dissolve into the hum of the engines. I landed in the south of Italy, in Puglia, where the warm, golden air met me like an old friend, and a private driver carried me through miles of silver olive groves to a place I had already bought without ever seeing it in person. It was an old stone masseria at the end of a long cypress lane, surrounded by the ancient dry stone trulli that the farmers of that region built by hand, without mortar, more than 1,000 years ago, and which still stand perfectly today. A mason spends his whole life chasing that kind of permanence. I carried my one bag inside, walked out onto the wide stone terrace, and poured myself a glass of deep red wine from a local vineyard. The evening air smelled of crushed grapes and wild lavender. There were no arrogant sons-in-law demanding my money. There were no ungrateful daughters complaining about their cars. There was only the wind moving through the old olive trees and the distant chirping of crickets, and a silence that was not the cold silence of a forgotten man waiting to die, but the warm, golden silence of a man who had defended his own life and won. I sat on that terrace a long while as the sun went down behind the far hills, and I ran my eyes over the trulli in the field below, those cone-roofed stone huts stacked dry, without a drop of mortar, by farmers who have been dust for 1,000 years. Whoever built them understood something my son-in-law never will. They understood that permanence is not stolen, and it is not forged. It is earned, one honest stone at a time, by men who respect the weight of what they are building. Those huts have outlasted empires, and they will outlast me, because they were built with respect instead of greed. I finished my wine as the first stars came out over the valley, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt genuinely, completely at rest, on ground that was mine, in a house that answered to no one. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson beneath it is as real as stone and mortar. I spent 50 years laying foundations, and if that trade taught me anything, it is that a structure never fails all at once. It fails at the one quiet joint that everyone stopped watching. Shared blood does not give a person the right to your endless sacrifice, and unconditional forgiveness, offered without basic respect, only cures concrete into entitlement. Never set yourself on fire to keep your ungrateful children warm. When someone shows you that they see your kindness as a weakness to exploit, believe them the first time and have the courage to walk away and let them collapse under the weight of their own making. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they built with their own hands. My name is Leon Whitaker, and the life they tried to take from me, I carried out in a single bag, and I rebuilt it on stone that answers to no one but me.